Welcome back from Tales from the Hangar with yours truly, Captain Don. This week we're filming at the famous Flying Circus in Bealton, Virginia, and my guest this week is John King from World War II fame. Good morning, John.
Good morning.
Nice to see you this morning.
Nice to see you.
And I wanted to start with our interview of what year you were born.
I was born in 1924, June 1924.
June 1924. That was a good year.
Good year in the annals of aviation history.
And what did your father do?
My father was a railroad car repairman until the Depression hit on in the 1929. He was laid off, and then he didn't do an awful lot for years after that.
I've heard that you have several brothers and sisters. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I had two younger sisters and an older brother. My youngest sister, she was about 9 months old when my mother died, and she was adopted to a family. And my sister was living with my aunt. She was a guardian, also my guardian. And my brother and I were putting into the Hershey orphanage at Hershey, Pennsylvania.
That's what I was getting to. I heard that you had about 20 brothers.
Yes, yeah. Well, we did live with, they're all brothers. We had about, well, maybe 1,000 in the school.
Oh,
and
really?
All from just preschool on up to 2 years, finishing 2 years in college. So we were all there together. We were all brothers. And
Well, do you still stay in touch with some of these people?
Oh, yes, yeah. We have reunions every year, and the school hosts get-togethers, food and everything. It's great to be able to get back to see the fellows. There are fewer and fewer around now that I know.
Well, what I want to get to is World War II. What an exciting time that must have been, well, for all of us that are of this age. And you are a Navy pilot.
That's true.
And I'd like to know how you got started in the flying business.
Well, actually, I was interested in aviation. I'd made model airplanes and would run every time I saw a neighbor who had an old Pied and Paul home built with a Ford engine in it. Anytime we heard that cranked up, I would run over and watch him fly that. And we'd do our own models. And in school, instead of listening to the teachers, I would draw airplanes, and I had some pretty fancy ones. But I was never hired as an aircraft designer. But I did start out as an auto mechanic. I spent 4 years in high school in the vocational shop, and 2 weeks in the shop, 2 weeks in academics. And I thought that was going to be my dirty hands for the rest of my life. But actually, about 3 months before, about 3 months before I graduated, a fellow come up to me and said, "Hey, look, I got this brochure from the Navy. They're looking for recruiting posters." So I looked at it, and the requirements were you had to be a U.S. citizen, you had to be 18 years old, you had to have 2 years of college. And I thought, oh my heavens, I've chosen the wrong. So that was Sunday, and on a Monday I went into the principal and I told him I want to go into the junior college, which was part of the Hershey school. And he said, well, you don't have the background for that, you couldn't do it. I said, I can do it. And I kept bugging him. Every time I'd see him in a hallway or something, I said, you have a spot for me yet? So a month before we were ready to graduate, he called me and he said, okay, I've got a spot at the Hershey Junior College for you, and you better not foul up because I'm counting on you. So I said I won't, and I didn't, but I did in September of '41. I started my freshman year, and then December 7th, we had the big Pearl Harbor event, and so the next month, 4 or 5 of us went down to Philadelphia to sign up to the Navy program, but you had to have 2 years of college. So I got accepted for that, but they said, well, the pipeline's full for training, so you go ahead and finish your 2 years, and then we'll start you. So in June of 1943, I graduated, and 2 days later I was in the Navy starting my pre-flight training down in Philadelphia.
When did you hear about Pearl Harbor? Where were you? What were you doing?
We were, all the guys from the Hershey School were staying in one unit, and we were out playing football out on the front lawn, and some guy yelled out and said, "Hey, they bombed Pearl Harbor." And we didn't know, well, who's Pearl Harbor? We didn't know anything about that. But we listened, and then the narrative got so terrible that we thought we really got to pay attention. And of course, that was all the news at the time, so we were quite excited about the attack, and that's what drove us to sign up. And
I've heard this story before. It seemed like the whole country wanted to volunteer right then, get our revenge.
yeah, they really were galvanized to get going and take care of that. And actually, the Navy had a tough time before that. They could see this impending difficulty, say in 1939, and they wanted to build up their aviation training program. But it turned out the Air Force had gotten most of the civilian pilots and recruited them as their instructors, and the Navy had to use their own, and that was tough, taking them out of combat to teach we new guys. So they had a civilian pilot training program. They started out in Piper Cubs and then over into Stearman's. And
Now, you were in the cadet program.
yeah, it was called a V5. You had to have 2 years of college.
Did you call that a 2-year degree?
Yes, it was a
2-year
associate degree.
Great. Okay, and then you got that, and they called you up, and you left for flight training.
2 days later, yeah.
2 days later, flight training. And where was this?
This was at the University of Pennsylvania. It was pre-flight training. We had to learn recognition, the code. The Morse code was great, and that was the most difficult thing, to learn Morse code. We had to receive it 16 words a minute, and actually we really only had to know what the letters stand for, because we used them for radio navigation, and then the radio range had A and an N. Those are the only two letters you had to know. A, which is dit-da, and N, which is da-dit. So, but we had to do this every day, and had a couple waves that would have these, would send the Morse code, and we'd have to copy it down, and that was difficult. But then we learned all about meteorology, and it was really good training. It was first class.
Okay, now your first airplane was a Piper.
Piper Cub. We got, and that I went over to F&M College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and most of the students had left, so we used up most of the campus, and we'd have a ground school half a day and flying half a day, and so we got 40 hours.
And what color were these airplanes?
These were yellow, just standard Piper Cubs. It wasn't the
airplane.
military. And we had
65 horsepower.
65 horsepower and
wooden propeller.
Wooden propeller. And let me tell you about my solo flight in the Piper Cub. I was sent out, and this was in October. It was a moist day, a little damp, and I knew very little about aircraft carburetor icing, but we were supposed to practice our engine off stalled. So I got up to 2,000 feet and fairly, maybe within 10 miles of the field, and pulled back the throttle, started my stall, and then the engine quit. And I thought, well, I'll just nose down and get the prop spinning and take off again and go again. And it didn't turn. It just didn't have the speed. So
Yep.
I picked out a field and landed. Of course, I landed downwind, but I knew I could make it in. And then we had a rule that you had to, the instructor, you weren't allowed to take off and fly it back, because then you set yourself up for another accident. So you had to call the base, the instructor drove out and flew the plane back, and I drove his car back. But before he got there, I was able to turn the plane around and make it look like it was a good selection. So,
Your end of the wind landing.
the end of the wind, yeah. So
Well, how much total time did you have by then?
just 40 hours when I finished. Well, I just had 6 hours, yeah.
6 hours.
6 hours.
And you soloed whether you wanted to or not.
Well, and he said, you got it, just take off. I mean, he got out of the plane and said, take it, so
Yeah.
it was a great school.
That was good. And then from the Cub, what was your next airplane?
Well, the next airplane was a Stearman, and that was out at Kokomo, Indiana, in February we started flying those. It was cold. We had
Aye.
really sheep-lined
Open-
boots.
open cockpit
And we had ski masks, and the communication was a Gosport tube that we always flew it from the front seat because you transition from that to a fighter plane. You're right in the center of the three axes of flight right there. So we flew always from the front seat. I never got in the back seat until I got my Waco here at the circus. So we went ahead and he had the Gosport tube, which his voice tube would go in a tube up to my ears, and I had no way to talk back. I mean, you took me.
Oh, it's a one-way conversation.
One way, yeah. And so if he'd get peed off at you, he'd spit in the Gosport tube and stick it out in the airstream. And you'd get that in your ear.
That was a dirty trick.
That was terrible, yeah.
I had never heard that before. Well, now tell me, these instructors, do they ever swear at you?
Not really. I mean,
They kept it pretty
yeah,
decent, huh?
They might have sworn in themselves, or they probably did.
Well, tell me that the Stearman was a Boeing product, right?
Yes, yeah, it was made in Wichita, Kansas, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Good training airplane. And for your information, in 1939, the military knew they were going to have to build up and have a lot of primary trainers. So they bought 12 Stearmans and 12 Wacos and had them fly off down in Maxwell Field to see which one they were going to mass produce. And they actually went ahead and chose, they rightfully chose a Stearman. That is harder to fly. The gear is narrow, and it's a little bit harder to fly. You have to keep flying that until you shut off the engine and get out of it. With the Stearman, with the Waco, it's wide gear and close to the ground effectively squeezes down. Every landing is good. And so they wisely chose the Stearman and made about 8,000 of those. The Stearman people, the Waco people, were given the money to make 600 of the Wacos, trainers, and those were given to universities and colleges throughout the United States. And they the guys would get maybe 4 hours in a plane to see if they got sick and if they were suited. And they got rid of a lot of people who weren't suited for training. And then they got into the regular training with the military.
I always thought that was a little unfair because a kid would get airsick because that was something he could eventually get over probably, but maybe not. I don't know.
You could, but when I went down from my flight physical, when I signed up in January of '41, we got the medical, and in the doctor's office, they put us in a chair and had us close our eyes and spun us around a couple times. And then you had to stand there. And I almost got sick there. I started edging over the sink. I was going to throw up, but I thought, I've got to beat this. I'm not going to do it.
You can't
So
do
I got
that.
through that. But on my first acrobatic flight in the Stearman, the instructor did most of it. Of course, I dropped my cookies on that, but you get over that. When you're doing it yourself, you
Yeah.
don't have that problem.
Yeah, you can kind of tighten up your stomach muscles and brace for it a little bit, but if somebody else surprises you, why it's...
Not only surprises, but I didn't know what acrobatics were or anything like that. And here we're upside down and spinning around. But actually, you got used to it. We got pretty.
Okay, tell me then, you got how much time in the Stearman?
We got 60 hours in the Stearman, and then we were shipped down to Pensacola, Florida, and got into SNV, the Vultee vibrator, and that was a little added stuff to the airplane. There were flaps and the two position takeoff and landing or cruise propeller settings. So we only got 10 hours in that, but it was a lot of fun to fly that. And then over into the SNJ where.
Okay, now you say you came from Indiana to Florida.
Yeah.
And how did you travel?
Train.
Train, steam locomotive. I
Yeah,
expect.
stream and just obscure. All of us in coach seats and.
How long did that take you?
Oh, I think it must have been 8 or 9 hours or maybe 10 hours to get from Indiana down to Pensacola.
Well, that was pretty fast train for those days.
Well, I don't, it might have been a little bit longer, but I know we didn't stop overnight. We just went through. And we stopped at one little place, and there were ladies there that had sandwiches for us, and the whole country was behind the military then. It was great.
I think the whole country is behind the military right now. I think it's the best time to be in the military we've seen in a long time.
Well, there are a few dissenters, though.
A few dissenters. But in World War II, there was a few.
Not too many,
not
though.
many, though. Yeah.
Because we had a common goal there. We were pretty well beat up in Pearl Harbor.
Oh, yeah. This training at Pensacola, it must have been very, very exciting, and a beautiful neighborhood right on the Gulf of Mexico.
It was terrific. We did move from base to base. We started off at Chevalier Field, just learning to fly the Stearman, and then we went over to Whiting Field, which is over across Escambia Bay to the east of Pensacola, and there we got our instrument training. And you'd fly from the back seat and put a bag over your head so you couldn't see out.
Now that's you flew from the back seat of an SNJ, though. I presume.
SNJ.
Okay. Let's go back to the Stearman just a little bit. And what was the power plant on those aircraft at that time?
Most of them were Continentals. We did have some 9-cylinder Lycoming 220, excuse me, 220 horse power engines, and it was interesting. We didn't prop it. We had inertia starters.
We had these. Yeah, tell me about that. That's very interesting.
They were mounted on the back of the engine, and you'd crank that thing, and it was hard to crank at first, but as you got up speed, it got easier and easier. And then as you really got it going and you wanted to transfer that energy to starting the engine, they would pull out the crank and say contact, and then you'd have to say contact and turn the switch on, and it would start if you had it properly primed and everything. And usually we had a lot of women who were the mechanics there, and they would crank this thing, and if you didn't get it started, sometimes we'd do it purposely, we wouldn't turn the ignition on. And they did some foul mouth yelling at us. It was fun to hear this. So it was, we did have about 200, 250 Stearmans at Kokomo, and you'd get the number that you had to fly, and so that you wouldn't make a mistake in getting the wrong one, you'd write it on your hand in ink. And
you had to get the right tail number.
Oh, I had to get the right tail number, and then we'd all get in a cattle car, a big old trailer that a bunch of it could sit in, and go down the line. When you see your plane number, you'd yell, and it'd stop, and you'd get out. And occasionally, if you misread that, then you had to follow them and walk and try to find the thing yourself. It was a big outfit, and we occasionally, I stayed there for about 5 months, getting this 60 hours in the Stearman, and this was well into the early summer, and one time we had a thunderstorm, bad thunderstorms supposedly come through, so they tied a bunch of the planes out, and we had to push maybe about 50 of these Stearmans in the hangar, in the gymnasium. So we did that, and it was, Indiana was beautiful, flat, and a lot of places for emergency landings, and I really enjoyed it.
Well then, when you shipped to Pensacola, you transitioned to the Vultee, and then after the Vultee, well, tell me about the Vultee. I think that's an airplane that's kind of overlooked. I've heard rumors, I never flew the airplane, so I heard rumors about it being a snapping airplane and would spin and unintentionally spin. But you never found it that way, I guess.
Never. It was a docile airplane to fly, and it was the Navy's way of introducing a few more things for you to learn. This had flaps, which we didn't have in the Stearman. It had the 2-position propeller, one for takeoff and one for cruise, and you had to use that. But we only got 10 hours in that, and it was so easy to fly and we were out at Barron Field. We call it Bloody Barron because we had a lot of crashes there, and a lot of trouble. But we got 10 hours in it, and after a couple of hours, it was so easy to fly that for some of the enjoyment, we would come in for a landing and roll the tail wheel, keep the gear off the landing main wheels off of the runway, and get the tail wheel rolling. We could feel it rolling for about 500 feet of it, and then cut the power, let the wheels down, and turn off. And we were really hot pilots. And,
What did your instructors say about that? Or were you kind of on
oh, they got at us, but when
discreet.
they yeah, we'd do it way down at the far end of the runway so they couldn't see it.
Yeah. Okay.
Good machine.
Well, I was lucky enough to own an S&J 5 for about 15 or 20 years, and that was one of my favorite airplanes, all-time favorite airplanes. What was your opinion of the S&J?
It was great. I enjoyed flying it, but it got a little old. I have a lot of time in the J. After I got my wings and flew the Hellcats, the Hellcat was so easy to fly, and we were up in Glenview, Illinois, ready to go out on Lake Michigan to get our carrier landings. And excuse me, we needed 15 knots of wind over the lake so that this old coal carrier that would only go 7 knots, and if we had 15, it'd bring us about 20 to 25 miles an hour relative speed, and that way we could bring a Hellcat in this 400-foot deck and land. We had to get six landings in that.
Really? I had never heard that story before. You had old coal tenders, they put a deck on them.
There were 2 of them. They put the
They weren't
deck on.
aircraft carriers at all?
No, they couldn't spare an aircraft carrier. That had to
But
go
then
out.
you had a cable that caught you.
Had the six wires, and actually we needed that wind. And while I was there, we waited a week. Well, the winds were only about 10 knots, and they said, well, "Okay, come back, go on Liberty."
Now, there was no go around. If you didn't catch a wire, you went in the water, I suppose.
No, we didn't have the cage in front like you did with the tapes that on an ordinary carrier that they would put up on every landing. If you didn't get a wire, you would go into that. And on this one, I think you could just go ahead and it never came out because there's by the time you think, did I catch a wire or not, you wanted that time. Now the modern jets, the procedure is with the canted deck, if you don't, when you come in for landing with a jet, it takes about 6 seconds to spool up the engine to get power. So as soon as you land, you jam the power up to full, and if you stop, you can take it off. If not, you have it spooled up and you can take off and leave. But I don't, maybe we were too hot pilots. We didn't
Well,
go
you
around.
were young and
But I'll tell you, the first carrier landing, it was so traumatic. As soon as you land, why, they gave you a signal, flaps up, and hooks up, and I think I must have sat there 30 seconds. And
said,
I'm glad I'm aboard.
Well, I did that.
And then finally, I realized what they wanted, and I put my...
Now, you're flying what type of airplane again?
That was a Hellcat, but we didn't have the wind over, so they said, let's put you in SNJs and you can get your carrier landings, and it was just mostly paperwork. So they gave a couple guys the SNJ and said, "You try that. We'll do some carrier landing practice here on a little field next to Chicago." And that was so drastic. I mean, the J is harder to fly than the Hellcat. Oh yes, it is. Yeah. So they said, "Okay, you guys wait. We'll get the wind." And so in 7 days, the wind came back up, and we got back on the Hellcats and went out and got our landings.
I'm a little surprised. You flew the FM2 Wildcat also, did you not?
Yeah.
But it was an older airplane. Usually you would think of a person flying it first and the Hellcat second, maybe.
Well, I got to fly that in photo school. I was selected to be the photo pilot for the fighter, for the air group. And we had an FM, I don't know whether it was a Grumman or a General Motors FM. It was a Wildcat.
That's been one of my favorite airplanes all my life.
It was a little jewel, and because it was a photo pilot, we didn't have any armor plate in the thing. It was light.
Lightweight.
All light, and we had the photo school next to an Army base up in Pennsylvania, and we'd have a rivalry. The Lightnings would come in, we'd have a dogfight, and whoever got in the other guy's tail and couldn't get off, you had to go back to your field sometimes. So here you go back to your own field with this lightning on the back, and everybody knew that you'd been disgraced. But the same way, when we'd go into their field, and we could always beat the Lightning.
When you say Lightning, what are you talking about?
The P-38.
The P-38.
Yeah, that's
Twin engine.
Lockheed.
But
P-38.
they couldn't turn inside of you. You could outturn them, I
Oh,
guess.
we were light, and the F4F is really nice. The bad part of that was the mechanical gear. You had to crank that thing 26 turns to get the gear up, and on takeoff, to help that, you'd get a little bit of altitude, and then you push the nose down, and then crank while it was getting that lift out of it, and then so you'd always see a Hellcat go up in steps rather than a smooth climb. And by the same token, if you made a bad landing, the oleos were easy to collapse completely, and then they had to pump them up, and everybody knew if you come in with your one wing low that you'd made a bad landing, so you had to endure things like that.
Okay, now we've flown the Wildcat, the Hellcat, and then what was next?
The next was the PBM, and that happened as soon as the war ended in August of 45. The notice came up on the bulletin board saying anybody wanting twin engine training, sign up, and there were 16 pilots in our fighter squadron, and all 16 signed up for it because that F-7F was a twin engine fighter, and it really was going to be a joy.
Okay,
So
now I'm not familiar with that airplane. You call it a PBM.
no, I'm talking about the one that they said we were going to get training
I
in,
see.
the F-7F.
Oh.
That was just a new aircraft then. So, no, well, we all signed up for that training, and then 2 weeks later, the orders came for patrol boats down in Panama. And of the 16, I was the only one that the other guys got out of the Navy, and I went on down to Panama. But transitioning from a fighter where your navigation was a little plotting board underneath the instrument panel, you'd pull out, and you'd go out maybe 200 miles, go over for a search, and then you had to lead the carrier back. You had to do all this plotting on this plotting board. And we got down there. Here was celestial navigation. We had few courses in it, but I've never had a sextant. So we had to learn all that, and then instead of having one engine, why there were two throttles in this plane, and instead of land, why we had to have water, and you have to know a bit about the wind and how to come in and work that machine. And so it was great. I enjoyed it.
Did you were you disappointed in that assignment, or did you?
No,
just
it turned out well. Panama is a delightful place for living.
I've heard it is.
And we spent about 20 days a month up in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, flying air-sea rescue missions. Somebody out on a tanker would have appendicitis. We'd have to go out and land, and they'd bring them out, and we'd fly them back to the hospital in.
Now you've got
Guantanamo.
pictures of this airplane.
Yes, I've got.
And whose manufacturer was that?
This was Martin,
Martin.
up in Little River, just north of Baltimore.
Martin Field.
You know,
And these airplanes, what kind of power plant did they have on them?
that had the R-2800, I believe, and I think it was.
Well, that must have made a pretty nice performing airplane.
Yeah, it was good. We also had the JADO capability if we were really loaded with fuel. We had 18-hour patrols and had to fly. And this was in Russian submarines would be down in the Caribbean, and we had to keep track of them. And so we also did a lot of the air-sea rescue. I remember one time we were in Gitmo, and we had to go up to a small lake up in the eastern part of Cuba. Some foreign attaché up there had a bad toothache, and we had to pick him up and landed in the lake, and which was a large enough lake. But then they had this boat that they rolled out with the natives, and in addition to giving us the naval attaché, or the foreign attaché, we got a big bunch of bananas and flew back.
Well, John, this is your first boat pilot, seaplane pilot, And in my opinion, they're cut above all the other pilots. That's just
true.
my opinion. But then you talk about these heavy airplanes and 17, 18-hour missions, and you're heavy with fuel, and you need to get out of a short place, and you have a booster called a JATO. Tell me about that.
The nickname was JATO, and it was Jet Assisted Takeoff. And these were cartridges with jet fuel in it that we could hang. We would hang about 6 of them on each side of the PBM, and as we got up in the step, that means we weren't wallowing in the water, pushing the water. We were up just skimming the water, ready to take off. To give us that last boost, we would hit a switch and all these bottles would fire at once, and that would really give us a thrust to get us airborne and off.
Could you feel the acceleration?
Oh yes, yeah, it was really noticeable.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah. And later on in the Martin Mars, we had 8 on each side of the airplane, and when the Korean War started, they automatically, or just initially said, okay, your gross weight is going to be up 20,000 pounds. So a lot of our flights had to be jet-assisted takeoff from the San Francisco Bay as we're heading out to Hawaii. And that was really necessary, otherwise we'd have hit the Bay Bridge there. You know?
You would go under, you wasn't going to go over the top of it, huh? Well, now, tell me about that airplane.
The JRM?
Yes.
Martin Mars, that was a transport airplane. We had the capability to fly 40 passengers in really beautiful comfort, or 100 troops, you know, just sitting on hard seats. And we had 2 decks. We had a passenger deck on the back that we had about 16 really plush seats. That was for the admirals and the high-ranking officers. The rest of the people were down below in fairly nice seats. But when we had to take a bunch of troops, they'd take those out and just sit on little platforms. So we...
What kind of a cruise speed did you have on that airplane?
About 140 knots, as I recall.
About the same as a DC-3, or
Yeah.
about all those vintage airplanes are about the same speed, I guess.
It was the same speed, but we had the comfort of, we had the 2 decks, like the 747 has now. We were able to, the mechanics were able to go out, and every hour they'd go out, open up a hatch, and walk into the wing. They could stoop down, but walk from one engine to another, open a panel and look at the carburetor, see if it's leaking or anything like that. And if something like the carburetor is leaking badly or something, they would be able to shut down that engine, take the carburetor off, bring it in, and on their work table, put a new gasket in, and get this, all while you have your other 3 engines that you're working, but be able to put it back up again and start it up.
That's when you call flight engineers really flight engineers. They were flight mechanics.
They were good. They were.
And that's remarkable looking back at it nowadays, isn't it?
It was. An interesting part of that, too, we had 4 bunks up on the flight deck, and when the plane was first given to us, well, because of the ease of getting to it, they had the pilot. We had 2 pilots and 2 navigators. In that squadron, you worked yourself up from second navigator, first navigator, co-pilot, and then finally plane commander. So you knew the plane pretty well.
Oh,
You got there. But the bunks were arranged that way so that the pilots and navigators could get easier to it than the ones further back for the mechanics and the radiomen. And after about 6 months, all of a sudden, a prop came loose, and one of the blades came in through the... There was no one in the bunks at the time, but a blade came through the forward bunks. Next flight, where the radiomen and the mechanics were in the forward.
It's the old seniority system
That's
again.
right, yeah. The most.
Well, now this airplane that had a prop come off, did it survive?
Oh yeah, we had.
It kept it in the air. That's I've heard these stories all my life of just unbelievable how an airplane would come unraveled and still survive. You know.
We had a point of no return, which was halfway out to Hawaii, and we had a push. Well, that was the equal time point there, but a point of no return. When you got past that, no matter what happened, you had to continue because the winds wouldn't let you get back to your own base. So one time we had a plane. They had just gone out to the Korean War started, and they wanted to see if they could set up a seaplane route for us to take material and personnel out to Korea. They went up to Seoul and then back to Osaka, Japan, and there they did some shopping. They had an empty plane coming back, so they got Noritake China and all this Japanese stuff. One guy got a British fold-up bicycle, and he wanted one of those. So they put it all aboard and came back, started out. And after they got past the point of no return, one of the engines started acting up. And so as soon as it was the first navigator, he heard that this was happening, he went back and got the flight nurse. We had a flight nurse along in every trip. And he had her put it up in the upper deck under a seat. And it wasn't 15 minutes later that the captain said, okay, everything gets thrown overboard. So he opened up that big hatch, and luggage, all this Noritake China that you pay duty on, and everything, except this guy's bicycle was still up under the seat, but everything went over the side, clothing and everything. So another engine started acting up a little bit, and we could hear this. I was on the duty officer at the time, and you could hear this on the radio news, who were monitoring this air traffic radio. So they were telling how that they're trying to make it in. They're approaching Half Moon Bay, and even then, another engine started acting up and losing power. But luckily, they were able to come across and on an engine and a half and land in the San Francisco Bay. And we had
1.5 engines keeping you afloat, keeping you airborne.
Airborne. Well, it just had enough power. Those were right engines, and we also had one that had the 4360 engine, the 4 banks of cylinders.
Yeah.
And that was more powerful, but the right engines were
That
pretty
would be
reliable.
3350s.
Yeah.
I presume. Is that
I
correct?
think so, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 4360 was the
Yeah.
Pratt & Whitney.
Well, now tell me about, you obviously, as much boat time as you have, seaplane time. What about your open sea landings, water landings?
Well, our technique was to, usually out in the ocean, why you just have the big swells that come up, and then you have the white caps. You can tell the direction of the wind, so you know. But you don't really want to land into the wind, because the wind is blowing these wave things, so you want to try to catch the top of the white caps and skim on that, and then you just ride down into the wind and save it that way. And sometimes, I know the technique with the Air Force with their Albatross was to get about 20 foot in the air, chop the throttle and go in reverse and splash down.
Yeah.
That wasn't ours. We would land the machine and
I'm very interested in these open sea landings because I'm a boat pilot also, and I'll tell you, I try to look for some bay or protected water, and I suppose you did the same thing, but sometimes
it wasn't available.
Wasn't
Yeah.
available.
Yeah.
You had to put her in where you could.
You had to, if we were going out to, say, rescue a guy out in that had
well,
appendicitis out in on a tanker, we had to land nearby, and then they'd take a boat and bring the injured guy in, and we'd take him to a hospital in Cuba or down to Panama. So we didn't have a selection of that. We didn't have too much of the open sea stuff, but you really had to be careful on your technique on that.
Now, were you in the Atlantic or the Gulf side?
This was the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean.
Well, you know, the Gulf of Mexico can be mean, really rough.
Well, I guess they can all be mean too.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, I know, I've heard stories where it's knocked the gear doors off and they really hit hard, you know. Well, then, you know, I guess there was a lot of guys flying boats, but you're an unusual pilot. You're rare, I think. I have not known too many seaplane pilots, because then after the Korean War, we started building airports everywhere in the world,
Yeah.
and they weren't as necessary, I suspect. Well, after the big 4-engine flying boat, what was your next airplane?
Then I went back into the transport. Well, I went for a tour in transports, flying out of Anacostia. I'd fly the VIPs, Admirals. I was a personal pilot for the #2 man in the Navy, great fellow, Admiral Duncan. And the bad thing about it, he always could only fly on the weekends. So that put me to a 7-day a week workload there. But he was an interesting guy. He had to, quite at least once or twice a month, he'd fly up to New London, Connecticut. His son was in the submarine school there, so we'd fly up. And I noticed earlier on he'd read the chart. He was flying co-pilot for me, and just he and I would fly in the machine. And he'd fold up the chart and put it under his leg on his seat. I said, "Admiral, what are you doing that for?" He says, "I might lose a map sometime, and I'm not going to, it might blow out of the cockpit." He was a World War I pilot, and in the open cockpits of the 20s.
Yeah.
So that was his, he got in that habit of folding up. He didn't want to lose his chart and get lost.
Yeah, he'd had that experience or something like that. It happened.
But he was a great guy. And then we flew other people, the dignitaries, congressmen and everything. Very interesting. And then we went out to, I had to do some sea duty then, so they pulled me in for since I was a carrier pilot too, got into the heavy attack, which the Navy was given 18 months to produce a plane that could carry an atomic bomb off a carrier. If they didn't, then they thought, well, we'll just merge the Air Force and the Navy, and there'd be no longer any Naval Air Force. So the Navy quickly got North American to come up with this AJ, and they come up with one that had 2 Pratt & Whitney R-2800s. It had a J-33 engine in the back for high altitude and thrust for taking off. And the J-33 would take aviation fuel too, so you didn't have to have separate tanks for that.
And what year was this have been?
This was in 1954 that I went with them. They had introduced it maybe a year earlier. And we had the capability of carrying the Mark 6 A-bomb. And we had to I had 2 targets in Poland and Russia that were assigned to me. I had to know everything about that. And so we had to know how to get there and what the place looked like.
Very interesting.
But we also had the capability of, when we didn't have the A-bomb needed, we were tankers. We were able to put a tank back there, 7,000 pounds of fuel.
Next question, you're
So,
on board a carrier with this big...
and the wings didn't fold, so
they had to stow them on deck?
Yeah, and you couldn't, well, you could get a deck edge elevator, you could go over in that and take you down and it'd push you in. And that was an experience too. You'd see nothing but this rushing sea, and you'd be out there, the mechanic would be giving you a frantic call, come on, come on, come on, come on. And you didn't know whether he was right or wrong. You didn't want to push him.
You could have taxied off the
You could have
airplane.
easily, yeah. If you went, so you'd each along and you'd keep going. Finally, he get you out there and chalked, and then down, zoop, you were down, and they'd push you inside. And it was interesting. But we had, when we had the other guys had a mission, like the fighter pilots and that, we would take off first with 7,000 pounds of fuel. And then we'd meet them about halfway to their target. And then our tanker was not a probe thing. We just let a drogue down, a big funnel.
That's what I was going to ask, if you had a boom operator, but you didn't have
no boom. It was strictly, they nosed in themselves, and most of their nozzles were right in the front. And they could come in, slap it, and get the fuel. And you'd refuel, maybe give each of them enough, just so that we had enough fuel to get back to the carrier. And then they would go on to the mission. We would go ahead and refuel, get back, refuel, and then meet them when they're coming back. And then left one. But we, the funnel, I mean, most of the guys were able to come in and get their fuel pretty quickly. But they introduced the North American FJ. It was the Air Force, the Navy version of the Shooting Star, that's something that the Air Force had. But instead of the jet engine intake was up there in the nose, so they had to, on the side of the fuselage, put a probe out there with a 9-degree bend, and the guys would come in and try to hit this funnel. But as soon as if they come in normally, like they would with the probe, as soon as they got up there and the air pressure from fuselage would push the funnel
Push
away.
the funnel.
And they would get frustrated. So then the technique they soon learned was to come up, and when they got a foot or two from it, to jazz the throttle and slam into it.
You really hit it hard.
Yeah, and they could get it that way. So it...
Well, I'm curious about curious about after World War II, so many pilots and people that I knew of wanted to get out of the military. They'd had enough. What made you decide to stay in the Navy? You really liked it, didn't you?
I enjoyed the flying. I did. I never had duty at the Pentagon or any of that stuff. It was strictly flying, and that's what kept me in.
Okay, we're talking about you're on board an aircraft carrier, and you're flying a big heavy tanker. Also, you're capable of hauling atomic weapons. Now, when you had an atomic bomb on board, did you have a bombardier, or did you just drop this yourself?
No, we as a crew, I had a navigator. He was my bombardier.
Okay.
And then we had a mechanic. It was a 3-person crew. The mechanic had to be able to go back in when we were approaching the area, the target area. He had to open up a hole and push the little activator in and get it in, so as soon as it splashed, it would cause an explosion. So that had to be done. And the Mark 6A bomb was really a complicated thing. There were so many safeguards. It just wouldn't go off if it hit something. You had to have it drop so many feet, and circuit breakers would pop and close, and then finally it would get all armed, and we'd be dropping it from 25 or 30,000 feet. So you were able to get out away from it yourself.
Well, you didn't have you were a single pilot operation.
Yes, yeah. I had my bombardier, a pretty sharp little guy, an enlisted man, a first-class mechanic, that I thought, well, if I ever get incapacitated, well, I'd like him to know how to fly this thing.
Yeah.
So down in Florida, as part of training, we'd have time to do this. I got out of the seat, and I would have him fly and put down the gear and flaps and speeds control. We'd land on stratus layers, and I had him approach. Mm-hmm. And I knew if he could do that, he was going to get us back without smashing us.
Yeah.
So that was a good thing. The guy was a sharp pilot.
Well, you said your targets was in Poland.
Yeah.
And where else?
In Russia.
And was this water targets or land targets?
These were land targets, factory areas, and stuff like that.
That was the real thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, and you had to know that everything about the radar, what the imprint of the radar would look like, and this was all. We went over and over this. We'd train over and over on make the approach. And then once a year, we had to go up to the Albemarle Sound, and they had a target there. We would drop a shape, the same thing, same size as an atomic bomb, same weight, and that you'd have to have it within so many feet of the target. Otherwise, you were drummed out of the service, but we had to perform. So we kept practicing, and the Navy does this all the time.
Well, and that was had to have been top secret too.
Yeah, it was top secret. We had to have as a matter of fact, I had a mechanic who was my crew member as we started out, and then when we went through the top secret process, it turned out that his family was from, an uncle was still over in Poland. So they didn't give him a top secret. We had to get another mechanic and put him into service.
He would have been maybe sensitive to
the
target.
To blackmailing.
Yeah. Well, okay.
But these were trips it was about maybe a 10 or 12-hour flight. We'd take off from Sanford, Florida, right near Orlando, fly almost down to Havana, Cuba, and we do this at 50 foot off the ground. And we do this early in the morning and go over these lakes. The guy would be fishing there, and here we come droning over. He'd almost jump out of the boat hearing this noise. But we get down, and then back up to North Carolina and finally climbed our altitude and go in at 20,000 and drop
So you
this.
were trying to get under the radar, so
Yeah, and this was single palleted, so with the flight doctor, we had a squadron flight surgeon who would give us pep pills, and he said, "Oh, you can take this."
That was speed.
Yeah, it was. So we got that, and we said, take it about a half an hour before you're landing. Really be alert for your approach or anything like that. But he didn't tell us that after that, there was another 6 hours or so. We were all cranked up. We couldn't.
Yeah, that was a bad thing. Well, then, what was your the next airplane you flew?
Then I went back to Anacostia and Washington, D.C., and again I was flying the Convair 220 and the 320, and we had the Aztecs, we had SNBs, and let's see, even had one A3D, but one guy was assigned to that and that was Secretary of the Navy's plane. It did haul him around in it. So we had a variety of, and then R4Ds, we had, that's a DC-3, we had that. And luckily, while I was there, I decided to try to get my air transport pilot rating in case I was near retirement, so I got my transport pilot rating in the DC-3, and then I was fortunate, as soon as I retired, I got in with the United Airlines as a flight instructor. So I was a flight instructor for 4 years in the Vickers Viscount at Washington, D.C. 4-engine turboprop, beautiful airplane.
Yes.
The only thing, it could only carry 40 people.
I know.
So
yeah, it seems incredible nowadays, the loads that the modern jet carries compared to those airplanes. And in those days, we thought they were doing quite well, but...
well, that was a turboprop, Rolls-Royce engine, beautiful, very reliable. And it had the way that as soon as you touched down, the switch would collapse on the landing gear and put the props in ground fine. That would flatten out. It'd be like a 12-foot barn door out there.
Hitting the
Put
brick
your
wall
drag.
there
It would really slow you down in a hurry.
Yeah.
Good machine.
How many years do you spend in the Navy?
I spent 20 years, almost to the day.
20 years. Mm-hmm. And then you get your big retirement from that, I guess.
A little bit, you know.
Well, you earned every nickel of it, as far as I'm concerned. And then you got hired by United Airlines as a flight instructor.
Yeah, fortunate.
Which was quite unusual. But you didn't have a seniority number at that time.
No, we were part of management, and the line pilots were making maybe $4,000 a month, and we were limited to $1,000 a month, and we were management. So we didn't have any union protection or anything, and we did this for about 4 years, and finally got, and this was when United built up their personnel so much, the pilot personnel, that a lot of the guys that I trained and new hires, I came back, I was flying co-pilot for them when they were captain. It's just the way it worked out. But we did this for 4 years, and then they got rid of the Viscounts, and we're all moved out to Denver, which they have a big training, beautiful training base there, brand new, big simulators and the whole thing. So I elected to bid back to the line then, and so after just about 3 months of out there doing some ground school instructing, I came back as a line pilot in Washington at 737. Brand new machine, and they were the little short things. They could only get 97 people in it, but it was fun flying. It was like a little fighter plane.
Yeah,
it was great.
Great airplane. Well, now you have children that fly.
Yeah, I was lucky when I was in flying the Viscount training there in Washington. We had a simulator, and we had to keep it running 24 hours a day. That was the way the electronics felt better, but having to be on all the time. So after I had finished with my students in a simulator, we did a week of simulator and then a week of the plane, and then they got to check ride and got on the line. So I would schedule at my simulator time with these guys, say from 4 till 8, and then at 8 o'clock we'd get them out and debrief. And my son was going to University of Maryland then, and we had a little Taylor craft then that we flew around, and he needed some instrument training. So I'd stick him in the simulator, even though he didn't have the background for it. But he soon learned. With that, I got him about 100 hours in the simulator.
Oh, wow. Was that lucky?
We were charging the corporations $100 an hour for them to come in and fly it, but we were able to work him with that.
Where did you get the Taylor craft?
The Taylor craft, we had one of the simulator operators was always saying, I want to get an airplane, I want to fly it. And so we kept chatting about that. And finally one day I saw in a paper an auction for a Taylor craft at a local airport. So I told the guy, I'm going to go to it. You want to get in on it? He said, yeah, buy it. We'll share it, share the cost. So I went out and asked a person there where the Taylor craft. I got there a little bit early, and there was a ratty plane out there, and he said, that's it. But it looked too bad. I didn't want to mess with it. So I come back, and then I saw a lot of people over by a hangar. I thought, well, I'll see what that is. And here it was, the auction for the Taylor craft that was parked in there. It was in pretty good shape, but the engine cowling was open, and there, instead of the cylinder jugs on beyond, they were just the connecting rods sticking out. So that was going to be an added expense to put a new engine on or something. But I stayed for the auction and got it for $600. So each of us got this Taylor craft for $200. There was another engine, 65, but I didn't know a thing about light airplanes then. So that went for $100, and I didn't even bid on it because I didn't know a thing. So luckily, one of the pilots who was going through the training had a fixed base operation in Detroit. We told him about the airplane. He says, oh, I've got 4 jugs. I'll put them on for you for $150. So we got that thing flying, and these guys just flew the pants off of it. And,
well, and then just give your son a chance to build ours and get some experience. And of course, the Taylor craft's an awful good airplane.
Oh, it was easy to fly.
Yeah, it's a very nice airplane.
I remember I told him you had to do forced landings as part of your training, and I said, now you can go ahead and fly it, make your approach, nice field, pick out a place, and get low, and then add the power and go around. Don't land. And he didn't hear the don't land business. So I came out there one day, and here there was mud all over the bottom of the wings, and said, what in the world's that? He said, well, it was just muddy at this field where I landed.
Yeah, I did a little myself. Mm-hmm. Well, you've had a phenomenal career with the United States Navy. I'm very proud of you for all that. We all should be so lucky to have such a career. And then you had an airline career after that. And of course, as most of you may know or not know, that John here is a flying circus performer. And how long has the circus been going?
We have just finished our 38th year.
38 years of the flying circus. Now, were you here at the beginning?
I was almost here at the beginning. My son and I come out and looked at it before they had the first show and got interested in it. And the requirement was then that to join, you had to sign a note for $90,000. And if the rest of the guys didn't pay, you were responsible for it. That held us back a little bit, but finally we said, well, those guys are not going to happen. This was to buy all these planes that we had, the old Sopwith Pup and the...
You really started off with World War I aircraft.
Yes, and it was quite a show. The first day they had, the governor flew in with a helicopter and they had publicity up the gump stump, and we had people all the way from the field out to 17 and lined up there. The police were having a fit. We had to park the people in the neighbor's farm pasture over here, and he had a hay wagon, and he'd bring the people over back and forth, take them out to the parking. So we
had a really grand opening then.
Grand opening. We thought, oh, this is great. We're going to have our own company plane, and really, but that soon went down. We had to work to get the people out here. But it's been going on. We did finally have trouble with the finances, and after about 3 years, we were about ready to go bankrupt. So we sold the airplanes for $125,000 to a fellow up in the Poconos, and he tried to start a place up there.
Johnny, thanks so much for talking to us today. It's a great story, an American story from rags to riches, I would say. And so,
Thank you, Don. Appreciate it.
my pleasure.